Okay, this book is Red, Blue, and Yellow Yarn. It's a PJ book, library book. It's A Tale of Forgiveness by Miriam Kosman. Bubby, Donnie's grandmother, was here for a visit. She was planning to stay for a whole week. When Bubby came, she slept in Donnie's room, and Donnie had to sleep downstairs in the den. When Bubby was here, Donnie had to walk on tiptoes while she rested. He wasn't allowed to play ball on the wall of the house because Bubby didn't like the noise. Donnie had to wash with soap and a nail brush before every meal because Bubby would inspect his hands. Bubby always ate with a napkin on her lap and insisted that Donnie do the same. It seemed like whenever Bubby was here, Donnie got into trouble. She had so many rules, and somehow Donnie always managed to break some. Sometimes he wondered if Bubby even liked him. Right now, Bubby was in the kitchen talking to Mommy. No one would hear him if he crept into his room to see if he had left his little blue car on the bed. Slowly and quietly, Donnie opened the door. Then he just stopped and stared. Donnie's bed, the one Bubby was used now, was piled high with balls of yarn, green, yellow, blue, and pink, gray, yarn with flecks of black, brown yarn with flecks of orange. Donnie forgot all about his cars. He forgot that he wasn't allowed in Bubby's room. He didn't think about what Mom would say. He just couldn't stop himself from squeezing one ball of yarn and throwing it in the air. It was perfect for juggling. Donnie tossed up a blue one and a green one. The blue ball of yarn dropped and rolled into a corner, trailing a long blue tail after it. Donnie grabbed a yellow ball of yarn and kept on juggling. Red, green, yellow, blue, faster, higher. The balls just flew up, down, and out. Suddenly there were voices on the stairs. Mommy and Bubby were coming. The door opened and they both stood staring. Donnie looked around the room. What a mess! A carpet of colored yarn covered the floor. Strings of green, red snaked around the legs of the bed. Long strands of yellow yarn and blue yarn hung down from the dresser. The room was covered and the bed was empty. Donnie, Mommy gasped, what have you done? She tried to push the door open wider, but it was stuck on a clump of blue and red and yellow yarn. Donnie, she said, I can't expect you to wind up every one of these balls of yarn again, and I don't come back downstairs until you are finished. Slowly, Donnie picked up the end of the strands of yarn to begin to wind. He wound and wound until, oops, it came into a tangle. It was all twisted around the blue yarn. Donnie unraveled the knot and picked up two balls at a time. He tried rolling them together, stepping over and under each ball to get them straightened out. Soon he sat down with a plop. So much yarn was tied and twisted around his pants. How was he ever going to finish this? Donnie imagined himself as an old man, winding and winding, with his long beard covered with blue and yellow yarn. Donnie just started to cry. All at once, the door opened and Bubby walked in. Donnie jumped up and quickly wiped away his tears. Had Bubby come to tell him how wrong it was to touch her things? Bubby smiled. Come, Donnie, she said. You look like you could use some help. He couldn't believe it. Bubby didn't look angry. "Here," she said, untangling some strands from around Donnie's leg and handing it to him. "You start winding like this, and I'll work on the other end." The work went much faster with Bubby's help. She and Donnie walked around and around each other so that the yarn would unravel. Little by little, the room began to look neater. Bubby sat down and took out a piece of cardboard. She wrapped some yarn around the cardboard, turning it to form a perfect ball. Donnie sat down next to her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Bubby turned and looked right at him. "Donnie," she said in a smiley voice, "let me tell you a story about when I was a little girl." She tugged at a strand of red yarn and began her story. "One year, my grandmother came to us for Pesach. My grandmother was famous for her special Pesach nut cake, and we all looked forward to having her bake one for us." For hours and hours, my grandmother cracked nuts until she had a whole jar full. I loved nuts so much that I decided to take just one or two. I was sure no one would miss them. Donnie stared open-mouthed. He just couldn't picture Bubby as a little girl doing something so naughty. "Well," Bubby continued, "I opened the jar and reached in. Just as I was about to pull out a handful of nuts, the kitchen door opened and in walked my mother. I was so startled that I jumped backwards, pulling the jar with me. It crashed to the floor and smashed into 1,000 tiny pieces." Donnie forgot to be shy. "You did that, Bubby?" he asked, his voice squeaking in surprise. Bubby laughed at Donnie's surprised look and continued. "My mother was very angry. She said I had to sit at the table and crack nuts until I filled a whole new jar for my grandmother." "What did you do?" Bubby threw a yellow ball of yarn on the bed before she answered. "Well, I started cracking nuts. I worked for what seemed like a long time, and then I started to cry. My fingers hurt, and the bottom of the jar was barely covered. I could just imagine cracking nuts until I was an old lady." "Just like me," thought Donnie. As I was about to give up, in walked my grandmother. When she saw my tears on my face and the sack of unshelled nuts, she sat right down to help me. "Just like you," Donnie said delightedly. "Just like me. And do you know what my grandmother told me while we cracked the nuts?" "What?" "My grandmother told me that when she was a little girl, she had gone to her grandmother's house for a visit. Her grandmother had a big, fat feather pillow in the living room. And one morning when my grandmother was bored, she poked a hole in the pillow and started pulling out the feathers. When her grandmother walked in, the whole room was covered with feathers. Just like the yarn. Yes, just like the yarn. I couldn't imagine my grandmother ever doing something like that, but she said she did. Of course, her mother said she had to pick up all the feathers by herself. It was too hard. She started to cry, and guess who came to help her? Her grandmother, Donnie shouted. Of course. Bubby stood up and stretched. Donnie looked around the room. The bed was covered with neatly rolled balls of yarn, and the floor was clear. "Come on, Donnie," said Bubby. "I think your mother kept dinner waiting for us." "Are you finished already?" Mommy asked as they walked into the kitchen together. "Bubby, help me," Donnie said, smiling, as she thought of the generations of children who will make mistakes and their loving grandmothers who will forgive them. "Yes," said Bubby as she spread out her napkin and passed one to Donnie. "A little help from grandmother goes a long way." And Bubby and Donnie shared a secret smile.